Everyone, greetings from Mexico. My name is Melissa and I've been living in the Yucatan capital of Merida for the last 3.5 years. In November 2023, I bought my own house here in Merida, and I wanted to talk about the process of buying a house in Mexico because when I went through this myself, it was very overwhelming and daunting. Obviously, buying property is a big thing wherever in the world you are, but especially in a foreign country if you're dealing with contracts in a different language to your first language. Although there were some resources available online when I went through this, there wasn't something that was super comprehensive. So I wanted to make this video as a kind of comprehensive guide that I wish that I had when I went through this process myself. So I didn't know what to expect with this process, whether there would be a lot of bureaucracy and red tape and so on, whether it would be slow or stressful. But for me, the whole process from viewing the property, making the initial offer through to closing on the property and moving in took just 5.5 weeks. And I think that's especially impressive when I consider the fact that this was during the winter and the high season here in the Yucatan. So in this video, I'd like to address FAQs about buying property in Mexico, and I would like to talk through the different stages of this process from making the offer through to closing and moving into your house, hopefully without waffling too much. And then if you have any questions that you need to ask, you can drop me a comment below or you can reach out to me. You don't need to be a resident of Mexico in order to purchase property in Mexico. I have residency here in Mexico now, but at the time at which I bought my house, I was here on a tourist visa. So a tourist visa is sufficient, and there are also people who choose to invest in property in Mexico and do so online without ever stepping foot in the country. So having residency isn't a prerequisite. One of the most common myths that I hear about buying property in Mexico is that foreigners cannot buy property close to the coastline or on the beach. This is also false. You can buy property on the coast, on the beach, as long as you have a Fideicomiso, which is something that I will go into later. I do have a Fideicomiso, and if you buy a Fideicomiso, yes, you do own your house. Nobody can just take it away from you. It's not that somebody else owns the property. So I actually found my house on Facebook Marketplace, which I think sounds really bizarre, but honestly, here in Mexico, Facebook Marketplace is really popular for everything. Everything from selling household appliances, toasters and things, to searching for houses or cars that are for sale. Obviously, you need to use your common sense and do some due diligence if you're going to buy a house off Facebook Marketplace. You know, make sure that the person that says they own it actually do own it, that they're represented by a real estate agent, have the applicable legal representation and so on. But Mexican people will use this just as they would use a website selling real estate properties, right? We do have some decent real estate websites here in Mexico. So Inmuebles 24, Inmuebles 24 is quite a popular one that has listings all over the country. We used to have a really good site called Point 2 Homes where I found a lot of listings. This is an international website, but unfortunately no longer operates in Mexico. You'll also find a lot of kind of local, regional listing websites for different states and cities and so on. In the most kind of rudimentary way, the best way I think to start is to literally just Google, use a search engine to search for properties for sale in, XYZ city. There's a lot of Facebook groups that are very active here in Mexico, which can be a good source of information also. So search for things like, if you're looking at living in Puerto Vallarta, foreigners in Puerto Vallarta, expats in Mexico, if you're looking at Merida expat community, all these different groups, you can make a post within the group and look for recommendations on local real estate agents in that area, local websites and so on, and use a selection of different resources to search for properties. There'll be a lot of people in the groups also who have been through the process themselves in your specific city, so they can have some good information for you also. So I feel like I did actually fall in love with my house. Just seeing the images on Facebook before I actually saw it in person. Obviously I was telling myself not to get carried away because I needed to come and actually view it first. But when I came to the viewing, it was honestly love at first sight. I found that the property just stood out so much more against all the other houses that I've been to see. The rooms were a lot bigger and I really did like it straight away. But I didn't really know, kind of the protocol here. I didn't want to look too eager, too excited. So I was just trying to kind of play it cool and be kind of mysterious and nonchalant, like, the house is very nice, but I'm seeing many houses, I'll let you know. And after viewing the house in the morning, because I liked it so much, I actually then ended up calling the real estate agent that evening to say that I wanted to make an offer, right? After making an offer, something that does happen quite a lot in Mexico is that you will need to pay an apatado, right? Apatado, I think that I'm pronouncing that correctly. An apatado is basically, this is the step that comes before the Promesa, the promissory agreement. So you'll pay a very small fee just to kind of commit, to show that you're serious, right, about purchasing the house, purchasing whatever property it is while they take it off the market, right? So they will cancel any other viewings, they will take it off real estate listing websites, they might put on the website like kind of red marking saying under apatado, so that people know that somebody is going through the process of trying to buy that house, right? And they don't show it to other people. This is a very relatively small amount of money that you pay at this point, so it's around 20,000 pesos, or around $1,000 or so, which is then later subtracted from the total cost of the house, right? It's not an additional fee, and this is just to show that you're serious about it, so they're not holding a house for somebody who's like kind of blasé, like they don't know if they want it or not. If you then later decide that you don't want to go ahead with the purchase of the house, you do lose that apatado fee. So, you know, as long as you're serious, you can do that. We then went to the real estate office to pay this apatado fee and to just sign across to say that I paid that. At first they were saying, you know, we'll just process this now and then we'll contact a notary later. But just my personal preference is that I do everything with legal representation, right? Have everything in writing. And I think, you know, everybody's different with this, but I think this is a good way to be whenever you do anything involving buying or selling anything, or involving any kind of transfer of money. I didn't even want to hand over $1,000 for the apatado without knowing that I had everything documented in writing, right? Because I don't even want to lose $1,000 either, right? So initially they said that we could just do that there and then. I insisted that I wanted to have a notary present first. They were okay about that, and we went back again the next day to do the apatado, pay the fee, and the notary wrote out a kind of document to say, you know, this amount has been paid by Melissa to hold the house. We'll meet again on this date to do the promissory agreement, just so that everything was secure in writing. I think another thing that's worth keeping in mind is that in some parts of Mexico it is quite competitive in terms of the fact that there is a lot of demand for properties at the moment, especially in places like Merida and the Yucatan. So making a lowball offer is not considered productive. And I say that because if you see a house that's for sale for 3 million pesos, you might think, oh, you know, try and get the price down low, try and negotiate, offer 2.8 million pesos. But unless that house needs a lot of renovation work, unless it's in a bad condition or something like that, a lot of the time your lower offer is not going to be entertained, because the seller knows that, you know, if they have to wait a couple of weeks, couple of months, whatever, somebody's going to come along and offer the full price, right? Because in places like Merida, there is a lot of demand for property, so why are they going to shortchange themselves, essentially? Obviously, sometimes you ask real estate agents to show you different properties, and sometimes it will show you places that are slightly above your budget, in which case, you know, if you feel that you want to make an offer because you can't meet the full price, there's no harm in asking, right? But if you're just trying to kind of you know, offer a lower cost to try and get the costs down, sometimes you might end up shooting yourself in the foot and missing out on a house that you really like just because you were trying to get the price down, right? So take from that what you will. So it was about 10 days after I paid the apatado that I had to go back to the notary's office to do the promesa, which is the promissory agreement, promesa in Spanish, which is basically your promise to buy the house. It's not the final contract, it's what comes before it at the point that you pay the deposit. At this point, you need to take all your identification documents with you to the notary. So that can be your residency card if you have residency in Mexico, or it could be your passport. If you have your passport, you'll also need to show the passport stamp for entering Mexico to show that you have a tourist visa here in the country, and you will need to pay the deposit at this point. The deposit amount varies depending on where you are in Mexico, specific agreements of the house that you're buying. For the house that I bought in the Yucatan, I only paid a 10% deposit. There was a kind of cultural, I wouldn't say a cultural clash, but a cultural difference that I faced was the fact that here in the Yucatan, people typically pay the deposit to the seller. The seller will hold the deposit until the house purchase is closed, and then you pay the balance of the house. It's very different from somewhere where you might pay that into an escrow account and the funds aren't released until the sale is completed, right? So for me, it was a little shocking, and I think for the seller also, they didn't understand, like, oh, why do you need it to go into an escrow account? Why don't you trust me with that? So it was kind of a cultural difference there, but the seller seemed like a really nice person. We came to the understanding that we would do 5% paid to the seller directly, and 5% would be a cashier's check held by the notary in his lockbox to be released to the seller when I finally confirmed that everything had been handed over with the sale. The sale was finalized. So I was pretty comfortable with that. Obviously, I didn't even want to lose 5%. You know, it seemed a little risky to me, but that's just the way things are done in the Yucatan and in different states of Mexico too. And I did trust in the notary, right? I had an excellent notary here in the Yucatan. Everything was documented, everything was in writing. So I was very comfortable with that. All of the legal documents like the Promesa, the promissory agreement, the final sales contract, and everything else needs to be in Spanish, right? I speak Spanish conversationally, at least. My partner is Mexican. But you know, when it comes to contractual things, legal things, it can be a little overwhelming. You can have your notary translate it into English for you, like give you an English copy of everything, but the legally binding document will be the Spanish version. When I went through all of the documents, the notary was bilingual, and he sat with me and went through everything line by line to tell me, you know, its English equivalent, right? Before I signed anything, to make sure I didn't sign anything that I didn't understand. So I did appreciate that. So after we had signed the promissory contract, handed over the deposit, then it was just a case of waiting for the notary to say that we were ready to close on the house, right? And that process, as I said, took about 5.5 weeks in all. During that time, the notary is doing everything behind the scenes, right? So he is checking that the property is free from liens to make sure that all of the documentation provided by the seller is correct, that the seller is the owner of the house. They will apply to Mexico City if you're the foreign office to confirm that you've purchased a house in Mexico. They will sort out your fideicomiso if you need a fideicomiso, transfer the title deeds into your name, and so on. And all of these different stages can take a couple of weeks, couple of months, right? You only need a fideicomiso if your property is located within 40 kilometers of the coastline. It's due to a kind of an old law in Mexico, which exists because of this kind of loophole being how Americans stole areas of land from Mexico. We're not going to go into that. But a legal loophole for that is having a fideicomiso. So a fideicomiso is a bank trust where you manage the title deeds of the house along with the bank. Yes, you do own the house. It's not that the bank owns the house or anybody can take the house off you or anything like that. And the bank trust is established for 50 years. If you're still alive, if you're still here at the end of the 50 years, you can have that extended for another 50 years and so on and so forth. You'll also be asked to name a beneficiary when you set up the fideicomiso in case you become incapacitated in any way or something happens to you. This will be the person who will take on the house and the fideicomiso when you're not here, right? If you do obtain Mexican citizenship, you can become a Mexican citizen after living in Mexico for 7 years, or you put a Mexican on the deeds. If you marry a Mexican, put them on the deeds, or you transfer the house to a Mexican. You don't have to pay a fideicomiso. It's only for foreigners. And as I say, it's only if you're within 40 kilometers of the coastline. So here in Merida, all the properties are within 40 kilometers of the coastline and do require a fideicomiso. If you're in Mexico City, San Miguel de Allende, Querétaro, somewhere else in central Mexico, you don't require a fideicomiso. So establishing the fideicomiso costs $2,500 or thereabouts, and then you have to pay an annual fee of $550 to maintain the fideicomiso. And this will be due on the anniversary date that you closed on your house, right? In my case, the notary just set up the fideicomiso for me with a trusted bank that he used a lot. It was a relatively small bank here in the Yucatan. Sometimes you may have different options and the notary may liaise with you as to which one would be your preference, but it was great for me that, you know, he just took care of everything and had it all set up for me. So this comes into your final closing cost of the property, the fideicomiso and the first year fee for the fideicomiso. If you're buying a property from a foreigner, for example, you're buying a house in Mexico, it's currently owned by an American, they're selling it on to you, you can have the fideicomiso transferred from their name into your name. However, that isn't necessarily easier or faster, right? Because I've spoken to people, you know, just sharing this anecdotally, that there have been instances where I've spoken to people and the transfer of the fideicomiso actually took longer than it took to establish a new one, or sometimes it was super fast. So it just seems to be something that varies on a case-by-case basis, right? I think it's also important to keep in mind that your closing costs when you purchase a house in Mexico can often be as much as 10% of the total value of the property, right? So keep that in mind if you need to establish what your costs are going to be at the beginning of the process, you can chat with a notary before you start committing to purchase a house, just to get a kind of idea from them of what sort of fees that you'll be looking at, right? Because this is made up of things like the Fideicomiso, if that's applicable, the notary fees, which can be quite expensive and payable by you, the buyer, and also acquisition tax, which can vary depending on where you are in Mexico, and all the associated legal fees. My notary also organized a valuation where somebody came to check the house to make sure that it was priced correctly, and all of these things do add up. So, you know, for example, on a $200,000 house, you might be paying $20,000 in fees. So do keep that in mind. Another kind of quirk of this process was that the seller wanted to be paid a certain amount of the purchase price in literal cash, right? Which just wouldn't be a thing in other places, but in Mexico it's legal up to a certain amount, right? So I need to double check if it's changed, but at that point in time it was up to 700,000 pesos you could pay in cash. The house was much more than 700,000 pesos, but they wanted that amount, the maximum amount they could have in cash, because they were working on other projects, other housing developments, and they wanted to be able to pay their builders in cash. It was all legal and above board, because that is legal in Mexican law, and obviously the correct price of the house was documented in all the legal documents. So it wasn't like they were trying to fiddle anything or anything like that, but they wanted that in cash. For myself personally, I didn't feel comfortable with withdrawing a lot of cash from the bank, and then I didn't have a car at that point in time, so I didn't want to be traveling across the city with a backpack full of cash. 700,000 pesos is around like 30,000, 35,000 US dollars, depending on the exchange rate at that specific moment in time. So, you know, I didn't want to travel across the city with that by myself. The seller was very adamant that they wanted that amount in cash. So we came to the agreement that the majority of the balance of the house would be paid by cashier's check, and that amount, the maximum 700,000, would be paid in cash. But so that I didn't have to go to the bank and then transport the money by myself, we agreed that we would close on the house, the notary's office, and then the seller would come to the bank with me afterwards, and then we would count out the cash together. So that was very trusting of them also, that they, you know, were okay to close on the purchase and sign everything off and then receive the cash afterwards. I opened a bank account in Mexico specifically to deal with the process of buying my house here. It's not obligatory, but it just made things easier for me because I'm from the UK and my bank is the other side of the world. I wasn't able to make a huge transfer all at once for the full value of the house. So my maximum transfer limit was something like $20,000 a day. So I had to keep transferring money over in small increments until I transferred over the full amount of the house price. And then from there, I had a cashier's check issued from the bank in Mexico. Intercam is the only Mexican bank that offers bank accounts to foreigners that are in the country on a tourist visa. All the other banks require you to have temporary residency at the very least here in Mexico. So if you're here on a tourist visa and it makes things easier for you, if it makes things easier for you to have a Mexican bank account, then Intercam is the way to go. If you have temporary residency, you might find it preferable to open an account with somebody, if you don't have one already, with somebody like BBVA, Bancomer, Santander, HSBC, and so on. You have more options that way. But if you're from the US, Canada, you might be able to just do it directly from your own account, right? So that's just something that I needed to do. People at the Intercam branches, because they deal with a lot of foreigners, speak English, so that's another thing. You know, if your Spanish isn't, you know, up to where you want it to be yet, it's very easy to communicate with the staff there. So I had, after I transferred everything to Intercam, I had a cashier's check drawn out there, and then I gave that to the seller. Another thing to keep in mind is that Mexican banks can be very strict about borderless bank accounts, like Revolut, Wise, and so on. They don't like these being used. They really won't tolerate the use of them. And I say that because I had a Wise account, TransferWise, where I saved the deposit for the house. And when I had to pay the deposit, I transferred money from my TransferWise account, my Wise account, into my Mexican bank account, and it immediately flagged me up as potentially money laundering. I had to, answer a load of questions at the bank, go through money laundering checks, and my banker told me that if I did that again, my account might be closed. So that's worth keeping in mind, right? They won't tolerate these kinds of borderless accounts. It's only an official wire transfer from a legitimate bank, right, is the only way they will accept money into that. So as I mentioned, my house was ready for closing around 5.5 weeks after I had made the initial offer. So I received a call from the notary to say that we were ready to close. I received the call on a Monday, and on the Wednesday we had the meeting scheduled to close on the property. So at this point we signed the final sales contract for the house, obtained the final title deeds, transferred into my name. It was a really hefty document that we had to all sign, because of course it contained things like the valuation that a third party had carried out for the notary to make sure that the house was priced correctly for any kind of tax reasons, all the kind of land plans, the deeds, the information on the Fideicomiso, information on the beneficiary, and all of this different information we needed to sign and date each page of the contract. There was a small hurdle at this point in time because I was really excited after receiving the call from the notary that I was going to be able to move into the house on the Wednesday. On the Monday night, after speaking with the notary, I received a call from the seller to say that the windows weren't ready in the house. So this house was built on an existing structure, but it was completely remodeled. The guy had built extensions and redesigned it all, so essentially it's new. But he had some kind of miscommunication with the people working on the house, and they hadn't put in the cupboards. So there are kind of carpentered cupboards in the bedrooms, and they hadn't put in the windows. So the house was windowless, cupboardless, and he was saying, oh, it's okay, we'll close on it anyway, and like I promise that we'll get it sorted in the next week or so. I always err on the side of caution, and I didn't want to sign, pay the final amount for the house, sign everything away, and then he's not motivated to finish it, right? And unfortunately, it wasn't like there was a room missing or a wall missing or something. It was just the windows and the cupboards. But I didn't want to close on the house and not have it completed. So I contacted the notary for guidance at that point. He said, we'll go ahead with the closing as planned, was his recommendation. But with the cashier's check that he had for 5% of the deposit, he was going to hold that back until he had instruction from me that everything was completed. So I agreed to that. On the Tuesday, I came to the house to see that people were actually working on it, and there was a team of men here finishing everything off in the house. I was pretty happy with what I saw. Closed on the house on Wednesday, and it was ready a week later. They were just finalizing the fixtures with the windows. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you found it useful. Feel free to reach out to me in the comments below or on any of my social media handles if you have any questions. I want to continue making videos that are hopefully useful, especially in regards to emigrating to Mexico, life in Mexico, all the kind of legal things that you have to go through in Mexico, buying a house and so on. So I will make more videos in the near future. This is my first video, so I do apologize that I don't know the correct place to look. I feel like I'm looking at the camera and it's not, I'm looking kind of cross-eyed. But anyway, if you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate if you like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you very soon. Adios.